Last year, it was hard to avoid the alarming reports of wildfires in 4 continents, of floods, heat waves, storms, rising sea levels, drought, and increasing air pollution. Extreme weather events were once thought to occur in faraway places, and it was easy to think that we in the UK were safe from the consequences of an ever-warming world. That is no longer the case. In our neighbouring village, my friends and their 3-year-old son were rescued by boat in the middle of the night from their flooded home. The water supply in the nearby town was contaminated and undrinkable for a number of days. 10 years ago, it was unimaginable to think these things would happen here. At our Mothers Rise Up climate march, I heard of the harrowing effects of air pollution on the health of Rosamond Kissy Deborah's daughter, Ella Roberta. She died at just 9 years old from a severe, uncontrollable asthma attack. Rosamond knew that her daughter suffered as a direct result of the air pollution in Lewisham. Air pollution was consistently recorded above the World Health Organization recommended level, and Rosamond's long fight, after Rosamond's long fight, Ella is the first person in the UK to have air pollution listed as their cause of death. Since Ella's death in 2013, research has shown that air pollution decreases total lung volumes, or makes lungs smaller, and has effects on lung function, decreases their efficiency to breathe. These effects are potentially lifelong. Studies in many cities have shown that peaks in numbers of children coming to hospital with severe asthma correlate with peaks in air pollution. Elsewhere in the world, where air pollution levels are even higher, the health effects are even more significant. I heard of Dr. Arvind Kumar in the podcast, The Optimist. He is a thoracic surgeon in India and founder of the Lung Care Foundation. He noticed an increase in lung cancer in very young adults who had never smoked and linked this to a life of inhaling severely polluted air in the city of Delhi. 8 out of 10 children living in Delhi were shown to have poor lung function, and he now devotes much of his time trying to prevent lung disease by campaigning to reduce air pollution and to take action on climate change. The climate crisis and increasing loss of habitat for wildlife are causing changing patterns of infection, including new disease emergence and wider distribution of vector-borne diseases such as malaria and the Zika virus. The COVID pandemic is a challenging example of the outcome of humans' abuse of nature. Climate change has caused changing and unpredictable weather patterns here in the UK, and for some of this makes a lovely day at the beach. But the story is quite different when you speak to farmers. In 2018, a third of the UK's potato crop failed due to high temperatures. Elsewhere in the world, food production is down by as much as 80%. In the global south, drought in South Africa has caused malnutrition, death of children, but it also impacts our country, where escalating food prices increase food poverty, leading to malnutrition and resulting in lower educational attainment. Hand in hand with climate chaos, particularly scarcity of rainfall, comes conflict and migration, both of which cause disruption to education and have a long-term psychological impact on the well-being of children. This comes as no surprise to parents homeschooling in lockdown. Hospitals in the UK have seen an unprecedented increase in eating disorders, self-harm, and deliberate overdoses with suicidal intent. These climate-related threats to our children's health are set to be the most significant challenge to global health in our lifetime, and will undo the progress in improved health made over the last 25 years. But we don't have to accept this as our children's fate. We have a small window of opportunity to safeguard our children's health, provided we take action and use the power of the parent. Rupert will now tell us how.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. It's really exciting that it's finally happening. What we were being brought together by this little beauty, which is starting to arrive through some people's doors at the moment. And I'm so grateful for everyone from the organizations that have made this, well, maybe slightly historic launch possible. I'm just going to take a very few minutes to run you through what, in my view, is the essence of the book that I've brought you here, Parents for a Future. So I'm a philosopher. At the heart of the book is an implacable logic. It's very, very simple. It basically says, if you love and care for your children, as all human beings say they do, and it seems to be true, that care has to iterate, that care has to pass through the generations like a chain, because you can't succeed in loving your children if they are not able to love their children. So we have to find a way of keeping the future open so that our children, our descendants, can have the same love and care and be able to deliver it to their children as we seek to deliver to our children and nephews and nieces and so forth. So that very simple logic is enough, I argue, to motivate a care that goes far beyond a narrow care for only one's own children. The care or love for one's children, for those who one is giving care to, iterates down the generations and covers and ends up covering the whole earth, because you don't know where your children's children are going to be living. And in order to sustain them, well, they're going to need viable ecosystems to sustain them. So just loving your own children translates, I argue, into a care that iterates down the generations across the earth and across all beings. Now, this is a hopeful conclusion in the sense that it gives people a reason, even people who might think of themselves as relatively narrow in their care or even selfish. It gives people a reason to cast that care a lot wider. And what above all we need to do at this moment in history is to get parents and caregivers to understand that this care cannot be outsourced anymore. And again, that's absolutely central to my book. It can't be outsourced because governments are not riding to the rescue. Scientists do not have the power to deliver what their science shows should be delivered. And activists, well, so far there are far too few activists to be able to dramatically change the world in the way that it needs to be changed, and quickly. Because the next 12 months are going to frame the 2020s. Why? Well, because of the very important climate COP this year, which just so happens to be in the UK, in Glasgow. And even more important, because of the post-COVID reset. Because that reset is going to determine the course of the 2020s. The money that's spent in the next 12 to 18 months, that money is not going to be available later in the decade. The decisions that are made about infrastructure now, the decisions that are made about way of life now, to do with how or whether we commute, to do with whether we try to resurrect the completely catastrophic levels of air travel that were going on before the pandemic. Those decisions are going to determine what happens in this decade. So the next 12 months frames the decade, and the decade frames the century. We know that. We know that what happens this decade will determine whether there is a viable future this century. That's already absolutely clear from what scientists have been saying, from what the UN's been saying for years. And if you want to think still further ahead, the century frames the millennium, because it's going to, what happens this century is going to determine long-term processes such as whether the ice sheets completely melt and whether all the world's coastal cities are completely obliterated. So there's nothing more important than the next 12 months. I know that environmentalists have said this kind of thing before. It's true this time. There's no avoiding it. So my argument is we have to be as inclusive as possible. We need to mean it about this being a parents' movement, not a movement for woke parents or for left parents or for green parents. This needs to be for everyone, because it's open to anyone and everyone now to realize that this problem can't be outsourced any longer. The reason that I just described. No one's riding to the rescue, and we're out of time. So what I come to at the end of the book is suggestions for how we go forward from this point, and the kinds of serious action that are going to be needed if we're actually going to be able to move the dial in a much bigger way in the next 12 to 18 months. And I want to just very briefly lay that out now, and then I'll end my remarks. So 4 suggestions in, if you will, ascending order of challengingness. First, we need to do all the standard stuff. We need to get lots of parents, get caregivers, aunts and uncles, etc., who haven't done this kind of stuff before, to do things like vote more intelligently, lobby their MP, use their power as consumers, etc. But we all know that even if it's done on a larger scale, is not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough in the time available. It's just not up to scratch. So the next level, I would say, is there are huge opportunities for people to do a lot more in their jobs. I mean, for example, getting your company or your university or whatever it is to actually get serious about going carbon neutral and actually get serious about being more nature friendly. That's just an example, but it's obviously a very important example. The next level up, I would say, is not just what you do in your job, but what you do with your job, or perhaps by not going to your job. In other words, I have in mind their strikes. It seems to me that just as the school climate strikers have been incredibly successful in helping to start move the dial, it's time now for parents, it's time now for adults, it's time for all who are serious about parenting the future, if you will, to step into the frame and think, okay, if our children can go on strike, well, then why can't we for this cause? Not right now, not today, not next month even, but as the post-COVID recovery gets underway, this will be a potentially very viable stratagem. And then the final level, nonviolent direct action. XR, of course, has been groundbreaking in that area, but there's a need for more scale there. And if I may say so, as someone who's been very involved in XR until recently, I think also nonviolent direct action can be targeted sometimes a little more effectively than XR has sometimes done over the past 18 months or so. So 4 levels of commitment: the ordinary stuff, what you can do in your job, what you can do potentially by striking, and nonviolent direct action. And I think everybody can find their level within that. And that's one of the ways in which we can potentially be inclusive. Right, let me stop. I want to just say this. I wrote the book to help rocket fuel this emerging movement, strongly represented by the excellent organizations that have co-sponsored this launch here tonight. There's nothing I hope more than that the book helps succeed in that objective, and that we succeed, because there's nothing that matters more than that we succeed.
Thanks, Rupert. I'm technically the moderator tonight. I'm Bel, and I'm going to pass over to Rowan actually for the next 5 minutes to talk through your work as well.
So it is, hello everybody, by the way, and it's a huge pleasure to be here to help launch Rupert's fantastic book, which I have in my hand here, Parents for Future. And this is a book for me, which actually has a long precedent in Rupert's work going back at least 10 years. I remember reading a great report of his in 2011 called Guardians of the Future, which to me was one of the great pieces of work which helped me realize that there is this extraordinary political tragedy that future generations aren't given a voice. And there's a question of how do we actually do that in a meaningful way? And I think the brilliance of the new book really is to bring together, I think, 2 different kinds of moral thought, one about sort of the emotions and the other one about rationality, really, because I think we can all imagine, you know, young people we know in our lives. They could be our own children or grandchildren, nephews, nieces, as Rupert says, other young people, and imagine what their lives might be like in the years and decades ahead. You know, humans have this incredible ability to think forward in time. And I can imagine, you know, I've got 12-year-old twins. I can imagine my son, you know, he could well be alive in the year 2100. And we can all think about, well, what might these young people in our lives, what might their lives be like? And if you really think about it, as Rupert's saying about these iterations through time, you know, if I imagine my son in the year 2100, well, he's not alone sort of floating in space. He is part of a web of relationships and community, and also part of the web of the living world, the air he breathes, the water he drinks. So if I care about his life, I have to care about all life, you know, and then about his children or grandchildren and so on. And this is this emotion and rationality coming together, a kind of, you know, logic and care. And, you know, I think reason and emotion, a bit like Fred and Ginger or knife and fork, they work best when they work together. And this is what this book does. But I also think it taps into something really important sort of anthropologically, which is the fact that human beings are embedded in multi-generational kinship groups. There's this amazing research on something called the grandmother effect. And what this research shows is that communities which have a presence of grandparents, particularly maternal grandmothers, they have reduced infant mortality and child mortality. You know, because grandparents, like parents, have knowledge about dealing with, you know, if the child's ill or can provide care. And so we are embedded, at least going a couple of generations back and a couple of generations forward. And that sense of intergenerational linkage, I think, links to ideas which Rupert refers to in the book from indigenous cultures. So, for example, in many Native American communities, there's the idea of seventh generation decision making. And that's something that we can try and connect with, because the challenge we have is that we have been severed from our intergenerational linkages, severed by hyper-individualistic neoliberal culture, severed by the self-help industry and so many other forces which have exacerbated the me rather than the we in us. And we've got all this cultural knowledge we can potentially tap into, but we can also tap into, as Rupert's saying, that sort of sense of care which is so deep in us for young people, you know, in our lives. I guess one other thing I'd say here that why Rupert's book's important is this, for me, it's a kind of a handbook to a growing movement which I see emerging, which is a movement I call a movement of time rebels. These are people committed to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. Many of their representatives are here tonight. XR Families, Mothers Rise Up, Parents for Future. They're in other places too. They're, you know, in the legal movements in the US and elsewhere, people who are campaigning for the legal rights for current and future generations to a clean climate and healthy atmosphere. Amazing movement in the US called Our Children's Trust. There are similar legal cases going on, you know, in the Netherlands, Urgenda, if anybody knows that. And then, of course, there are all the legal struggles to give rights to the living world too, like the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this book can help us tap into that. There are, you know, all the people campaigning around alternative economic models like the donut economy. And then there are other time rebels in the racial justice movement campaigning against racial injustice, which gets passed on from generation to generation, embedded in criminal justice institutions and policing and cultural institutions more broadly. So, you know, there's this huge potential sort of unity for a rising time rebel movement to rise up, and it can be galvanized by books like Rupert's. And the final thing I'd say really is what I love about this book is it raises questions, sometimes difficult questions, like why do parents sometimes not act in the interests of their children by taking them on an airplane which pumps carbon into the sky, which is going to affect their lives? How much linkage can there be between a parents' movement around climate and ecological crisis, and also people who are worried about technological risks, like the risks of bioweapons or AI? And finally, I think there's one large question that we all have to answer, and I think Rupert's book helps us answer that, which is how can we be good ancestors? What actions are we going to take to be remembered well by the generations to come? And I say, read this book and you'll get a ton of insight into issues like that.
Thanks so much, Roman. Well, I want to thank all the speakers and Rowan, who'll be speaking as well, for such incredible insights. I'd argue that everyone who's concerned about the environment or the climate or the biological catastrophe is already a time rebel. We're thinking outside of our own bubbles into much wider circles. I also want to thank Jenny very much for reminding us that our children are currently having quite a difficult time. My little girl massively misses her friends, and that puts unique challenges on us as parents as well, thinking about all the things that we have to think about in terms of their future, but also their present. It's quite a bizarre moment to be in so many ways. I love all these parents' movements. There is something uniquely moving about seeing young people at an Extinction Rebellion event or any climate event. That sense that we are there as adults, preparing them to carry a burden for which we don't really know what form it'll take. But when I see a baby in a pram at a movement with her mum, and I know that emotion there driving us. As a mother, it is really, the thing that makes me work so hard is I have this I don't know exactly what's coming for her. I don't know what she's going to have to see. I don't know what she's going to have to experience in 2100. My daughter's 11. But I have such a sense of responsibility, such a grief that I won't be there to help her. And that drives so much of what I do. I think all the speakers, though, really clearly enunciated a challenge that every activist in the climate movement has, is that we have to exist in these hugely different worlds, don't we? Between reason and emotion, between present and future. And I want to come to a quote from Rupert's book. There's nothing more urgent than acting with a long view. And for me, you called it a seeming paradox about our situation, that sense of urgency, but that need to look not in the present, but into the future. And I wanted to get all of your reflections about that paradox. And I can start with anyone who wants to start, really, but Rowan, because we haven't heard from you.
Thanks, Bel. And firstly, thank you, Rupert, for helping to shine a light on parent climate activism. It feels like this is an area of work that really needs a lot more light shining on it. And we've been kind of building some of the foundations of this for the last couple of years, and it's really time for this movement to take off. So thank you for the timing of this book, to really kind of bring some attention to this area of work. And thank you for that thoughtful question, Bel. I think one of the things that I was thinking about when reading this book is that I've been really deeply grateful through the COVID pandemic for parenting very young children, and the fact that they really anchor me in the here and now. And the fact that, parenting very young children means that I can't worry too much about the what ifs, and I can't worry too much about the distant future. But that's something that we all need to find a way to hold both of those pieces, to kind of be and allow ourselves to feel the joy that we have, and be present in that love and joy of parenting, but also find ways to take action for their future. And that is really difficult. I think one of the quotes that I'd written down from the book was think long term and act now. And that feels very much like what we need to find ways to do, but also allowing ourselves to kind of feel that joy in the present moment, whilst acting in a way that is in line with our fears for the future.
Yeah. Roman?
Well, I just say that, there is a paradox here, right? Of course, that the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. We need it right here, right now. But in many ways, I think we're accustomed to this idea. There's this, we know that phrase, carpe diem, seize the day. Well, there's another related phrase that I like, which is carpamus diem, let's seize the day together. And, the plural form. And, we know what it's like to seize the day in everyday life. We can make a decision, for example, to have children, right? With consequences that go on for decades, right? But the action is here right now, but the reverberations go on. And I think, of course, that's what social activism is so much about. It's about taking action now that will reverberate for all the generations to come, and even beyond our own lifetimes. This is the idea of cathedral thinking, the idea of taking actions which go beyond our own career spans or lifespans. Now, I think we've got enough of those sort of brick and mortar cathedrals around. What we need are the ecological cathedrals of the future, and that's the policies, that's the direct action, there's the all sorts of things that we need to do. So I kind of love this paradox in a way, that because it's that juxtaposition, that we know that there are billions upon billions of children who may inhabit the future, and our grandchildren and their grandchildren and all the communities who they depend on. So let's do something for them right here, right now. There's no more greater existential act, I'd say, no greater act of agency.
Yeah. You're making me realize that actually one can't exist without the other, and that actually we feel so strongly the love and the joy of our children, that's what actually takes us onto the streets. Rupert, did you have any further thoughts about that?
Well, I'll just say one thing, which is I want to warn people about something which is going to happen in the next few years, which is that and it's something I discuss a bit in the book, there's going to be a lot of talk about geoengineering, or to give it a fancier, more recent name, negative emissions technologies. People are going to be saying, oh, right, it does turn out that the climate crisis is really desperate. So what we need to do is try to engineer the whole climate of the Earth to deal with it, because we haven't succeeded in reducing climate dangerous emissions enough. And this is, in my opinion, a really dangerous idea. It's a kind of giving up, but the reason I'm mentioning it in response to this question is kind of giving up on what we really need to do, which is to stop those emissions, etc. The reason I'm mentioning it in relation to this question is that it's very short-termist thinking. Basically, what the people who are pro geoengineering are going to be saying is, all right, you've convinced us it's an emergency. Well, let's do something really quick, like put mirrors in space to stop the Earth overheating. And that will stop the problem for a while. But it's totally not long-term thinking, because they're not thinking about, well, what's going to happen if we can't continue to put those mirrors in space in, say, 50 years' time or something. And they're not thinking about the potential long-term knock-on effects or so-called side effects of those kinds of interventions. So be on the lookout for this kind of talk of geoengineering solutions, which is going to get stronger and stronger in the next few years. And I would say that's an example of people not thinking through the paradox properly, not thinking, right, it's really urgent that we think long term. But geoengineering style thinking is not long-term thinking.
Yeah, it also seems like a very, very easy way for the current system to dodge the big changes that we really need to encompass. I had another question, which was there are themes that run through all of your work, really, and these are themes of connection, of compassion, and of empathy. And Roman, I was really intrigued to hear that you'd set up a empathy museum. So this is something that's been running through your work for a long time, but often it's about creating connection with periods of time that we will never experience, people we may never meet. But it seems to me increasingly important that we do this, that we widen our circle of compassion. And in fact, Rupert, I want to come to you because you did have this exercise, which is called the Widening Circles exercise, which is really about trying to connect with these entities that we will never know in a physical form, that we can only imagine, and how valuable that is to this work now.
Yeah. So this is one of a number of sort of imaginative exercises that I put in the book and asked people to do. I partly got the idea of putting these kind of exercises in from Rowan in his wonderful book, The Good Ancestor, where he does some of this kind of thing. And indeed, one of them is drawn directly from his book. I think that this is terribly important. It's not something we tend to do very much, but it is something that we can do, as Rowan said, really using our imaginations. And I've done some of this stuff myself, for example, with my teacher, Joanna Macy, is really where I started doing this work a long time ago. And it's incredibly powerful. I mean, when you actually try to do this, when you actually try to, before you do it, it seems like it's going to be impossible. But when you actually try to imagine into, say, the position of an animal or of a person living 200 years in the future or something, and you get somewhere with it, it's incredibly powerful. It's kind of life-changing, actually. It just changes and just broadens your whole perspective. I would love it if we managed to get a lot more of that going on in our culture. Imagine if that kind of thing were taught in schools. That could make a vast difference, I think, to the way that our culture frames these kinds of questions.
Yes, absolutely. Rowan, did you have any thoughts on this idea of widening the circle of compassion into the future, as well as into the minds of other sentient beings, potentially?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we try and think outside our own perspectives, and try and not limit ourselves to our own lived experience, but recognize that there's a wide range of lived experience, both human and non-human, and try and make sure that the actions that we're taking reflect our connection with the wider world. And I think it's also I found it really really encouraging and invigorating, connecting through the global parent climate movement and recognizing that some of the perspectives that I have as a parent in the position that I'm in is actually something that's shared by many parents. So with the Parents for Future global groups, we've got over 30 countries that are actively kind of collaborating within those networks, and the conversations there and the sort of the level of trust that we're able to build up by some of the shared experience, I found really encouraging in helping to build some kind of trusted connections internationally. But I think making sure that we also give time and space to think about our connections with the non-human world and across different types of time perception is really important. And Roman, I was really glad to hear you focusing in on the sort of the concept of togetherness and the concept of working together across different boundaries and different groupings. And I think that is really hugely important in this work. I think also this type of imagination speaks to the power of creativity, which is something that's hugely important in all forms of activism, but to try and think about how we can think creatively and teach our children to think creatively, or not stop them from thinking creatively, which they often are very good at doing at a young age and become increasingly less good at doing. But that's something that we're also trying to incorporate into more of the parent work, is various sort of imaginative and creative projects that I'm really excited that we'll be launching over the next few months. But it's interesting work.
Yeah, yes, the position of arts in expressing mindset change is really key, and also providing release. Roman, the idea of empathy and connection, obviously very important to your work.
Yeah, I've struggled for years with how do we step into the shoes of, empathize with what psychologists call cognitive empathy. How do we step into the shoes of future generations when we can't look them in the eye and talk to them and hear their voices? This is a hugely difficult thing to do. And of course, imagining our own loved ones is one way to do that. But there's another way, I think, which I think is really fundamental, which relates to this. And it's something I really learned from the great biomimicry thinker, Janine Benyus. She said, let's learn from nature's 3.8 billion years of R&D. And she asked the question, well, how have other species managed to survive and thrive for 10,000 generations or more, whether they're, bears or bats or beetles? And she says, well, the answer is this: it's by taking care of the place that will take care of their offspring. In other words, by living within the boundaries of the ecosystem in which they're embedded, by not fouling the nest, which is what humans have been doing at an ever-increasing pace and scale over the last century. So there is a lesson there about long-term thinking, not being about extending our time horizons, but about reconnecting with place, regenerating place, repairing place. So it's about, on one fundamental level, falling in love with ice sheets and savannas and meadows and rivers. And in a way, it relates to, there's a beautiful Mohawk blessing, which is spoken when a child is born. Thank you, Earth. You know the way. And I think in that is a, relating to sort of Joanna Macy's stuff that Rupert's talking about, a way of kind of connecting through falling in love with that living world around us.
I absolutely agree. We need to fall back in love with the living world around us, start to notice it more. Unfortunately, at the same time as that, there's all the grief, because just as you start to really fall in love with it again, you become more and more aware of how much is being lost. And I find this very, very hard with my little one. When I watch David Attenborough, for example, it takes me about 5 minutes before I'm in tears, and she's kind of looking at me going, what are you crying about? This is an amazing thing. And I'm thinking, well, it's an amazing thing that's so seriously under threat and being lost. And yet Rupert and I know that grief is such a key part of this. If we don't really grasp the full extent of what we're losing, how can we ever act in a way that measures up to that loss? This is also a thread that I know, and it relates to Jem Bendel's work, Deep Adaptation. But I wondered if you wanted to talk about the role of grief, of rage, potentially what we regard as negative emotions, how they can be turned around and used positively in this movement.
Yeah, so I make the argument in the book that, just as you say, Bel, we need these emotions. We need people to express their climate grief, their eco anxiety, whatever it is. And all of these so-called negative emotions actually come from love again, right? We grieve because we think we are losing what we love. We feel anxious or fearful because we're worried that what we love is going to be taken away from us or damaged, and so forth. So yeah, my claim is, and here I'm following the eco-psychologists and others, my claim is that these emotions have an enormous power. We shouldn't suppress them. We should express them. They are sort of disguised forms of the love that I'm talking about in the book. And that if they get expressed authentically, that could be an absolute game changer. And we've seen some of that. Some of us have done some of this through Extinction Rebellion. Greta Thunberg has done it herself. That's part of her superpower, is the authentic way in which she expresses her emotions, including grief and anger. And what I'm really hoping is that over the next 12, 18 months, we're going to find ways of getting a lot of parents doing things like getting in front of cameras and authentically expressing those emotions. And that can shift almost anything out of the way. I think that is one of the great hopes that we might have justifiably at this awful and wonderful historic moment that we're in.
You're right. Rowan and Roman, did you want to add to this sort of idea of the use of the negative emotion, the turning of it to become something more positive?
Sure, I can jump in.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it is really important, and I've certainly seen that it's hugely important within movement building that there's space for that, because if there's not space where groups can support each other with the difficult side of this work, then it rapidly can cause all sorts of other problems in the movement. So that's something that we're very conscious about, trying to make sure there are spaces for the big emotions, which are welcome and which are important. I think in parent climate activism, one of the kind of key elements of that, for me personally anyway, has been a sort of an acceptance of vulnerability. And I think parenting is an experience of vulnerability. From the moment your child is born, you suddenly realize that there's this part of your heart that's outside your body and you can't protect it from everything you'd like to. And accepting that kind of vulnerability of your children, and there's these things that you're not going to be able to protect them from, and trying to come to terms with that in some way and find some way to kind of live comfortably with that or accept it. There's lots of sort of big emotional elements to engaging in this work. And I think it's also, when you're talking about some of these darker emotions that run alongside parent climate activism, it is important to remember how overwhelmed lots of parents feel at the prospect of engaging in parent climate activism when there are these darker emotional elements to it. And particularly at the moment when parents are feeling pretty overwhelmed, it's kind of a big ask to ask parents to step up and take on something that feels so hard. So making sure that the supportive elements are there, I think, is really key.
Yeah.
Can I just come back briefly on that, Bel?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
I think Rowan's absolutely right. And I guess part of the way I'm seeing this in sort of strategic terms right now is that what we need to be doing is sort of preparing the ground for the moment where that becomes more possible. And I think that moment is in 2021, and it may not be many months away. And we need to be ready to seize it when it's there.
Yeah. Roman, did you want to add to this?
Oh, just briefly, I think of course, emotions like grief and anger have been incredibly important in galvanizing resistance movements through history. And actually, as you were all talking, I was thinking about Greta Thunberg saying, "Your house is on fire, I want you to panic." Now, I love that because, of course, panic, grief, all these things can be paralyzing at the level of movements, grassroots movements on the ground. But when it comes to communicating emotions with elite figures, economic and political elites, I think there's a real place for almost putting those kinds of emotions in their face to communicate panic. You should be panicking. You know, I want you to panic if you are the head of the IMF or whoever it is, or the chairman of Goldman Sachs. And, you know, again, historically, we know that when the impacts of things have hit those in powers. Sometimes they change. I mean, classic case would be the Great Stink of 1858, when the stench from the Thames was so bad that it even wafted into Parliament, and parliamentarians couldn't breathe and they had masks over their faces. Finally, then they passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers, which is still in use today, a huge public health revolution. So we need a little bit of panic in the right places, right times, right ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but that also refers to parenting. You know, I want Afra, for example, to see that I am grieving, but I also want her to see that I can pick myself up off the floor and walk past the policeman if I need to. So, you know, and it's a very particular challenge to us as parents, isn't it? Because, you know, we're told again and again that particularly for young children, we have to create this quite stable environment where there's not a lot of upheaval, but we also have to sort of balance it with trying to tell them the truth. In the classic XR first demand. So I'm going to ask my last question, really, which is, what are the best ways that we can serve our children now? What should we be teaching them? What should we be doing? Rupert, I think you were talking about this big movement that we could participate in, but I'd love to hear from all of you different aspects of how we can best serve our children now. And I'll start with Rupert again, actually, if that's all right.
Yeah, well, obviously this is a huge question. One could talk for hours on it. A very important, lovely question. One of the things I'm saying is we need to think at scale, and we need to think collectively about this. Another thing I would say, which is somewhat controversial, is that my belief is that as much as possible and from as early an age as possible, we should seek to come clean with the younger generation about this. And I do have a fair bit of experience of this, talking to children and young people in schools and so on. And my experience is that although sometimes it's hard, they really, really welcome it when you do this. And I've had young children say to me things like, oh, it's really good to understand these things. I haven't heard them before. And I've had university students say to me things like, this feels like the first time that someone from your generation has ever been frank with me, or ever come clean, or ever been truthful. And so, yeah, I'd say that as much as possible, while being careful, of course, let's take the bull by the horns on this one.
Yeah. Rowan, how can we best serve our children now?
I mean, I completely agree with Rupert. I think it starts with security, building that love for nature, connection with nature, and kind of connection with non-human species, and starting to understand our place in this whole ecosystem, that we're not at the top of anything, and challenge some of those kind of linguistic conceptions that we might have. I think making sure that children have an ability to appreciate joy, to kind of have gratitude for the good things in life, and that it doesn't all focus on the bad things. But then I think really deeply importantly, they need to see us stepping up. And I think this is important, not just practically because we're running out of time and because now is the time to step up. Now is our last best chance. 2021 has to be a crucial year. But psychologically for our children, if they don't see us stepping up, and if they do start to understand the severity of the situation we're in, and then they see us not act, that for them is deeply disempowering. And that is psychologically, I think, quite problematic, quite harmful. So I think it's really important that as they start to see the situation, as they start to realize where we are, they see the adults in their lives that love them, step up alongside them.
Yes. Because otherwise it's incredibly confusing, isn't it? That we're saying that this is so serious, and yet we're acting as if nothing's happening. And that kind of cognitive dissonance actually surrounds us everywhere. Yeah. Roman, last words before we how can we best serve our children?
A couple of thoughts come to mind. Well, one is just the general thing that, you know, our kids, my partner and my kids, hear us talking about ecological collapse all the time around the kitchen table, and we think, oh my God, what are we doing to them? But something really struck us, like when the climate strike started and our daughter was going on the climate strikes, for instance, she came back incredibly energized. Why? Because collective action makes you feel good, you know, and it gives you hope. And, you know, for her, I don't think you know, there's the facts of the crisis, but then there's also all those human connections which come through action. I think that's really important, and we know that as adults too. But what I was actually really going to say, something we haven't really talked about, which is the importance of rituals to connect us with each other, with the earth. And just to give you one little example, the other day I turned 50 and I went with my kids and my partner. We went on a bike ride to a local yew tree. This is in Oxford, which is about 1,000 years old. And you can climb up this yew tree. And we went and had a picnic in its branches. And we were talking about deep time, the fact that this tree had seen the English Civil War in the 17th century, had seen the Black Death in the 14th century, would probably be here long after we were gone, and both us and our kids. And I think these kinds of perspectives are part of what opens our minds to looking after the one world, the one planet we know that sustains life, but it also makes these things a kind of a habit and introduces a beauty and a sense of wonder. And I think there's a place for all of that too.
Yes. Thank you so much. So the discussion's over. I'm now going to introduce a short film that the different groups that are hosting this evening's event have put together. And in the film, we can see just some of the actions that the three host groups, and that's Exile Families, Parents for Future, and Mothers Rise Up, what they've organized over the past few years, and also the kind of environments that where we find and build community, which is so important for us. You'll notice a lot of kids there. So I'm just hoping that, Richard, that you're ready to go with the movie or the film.
We are mothers and we are rising. It's our children you're compromising.
We are fathers and we are rising. It's our children you are denying.
We are children and our hearts are breaking. It's our future that you are forsaking. We are rising. We are rising. We are rising.
We are hoping in the light of truth. 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 We are hoping, oh, we are hoping in the light of truth. We are hoping, oh, we are hoping in the light of truth.
I wish climate change wasn't real. I wish that the people in power will act now and stop killing all the animals and stop burning the forests. You are always cutting down our trees, but I don't like it because I love trees. I wish for the flowers to be healthy and well, and I wish for the trees to be feeded very nicely.
We are hoping in the light of truth. 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 We are hoping, oh, we are hoping in the light of truth. We are hoping, oh, we are hoping in the light of truth.
Anyone who's been on these marches, there's quite a few little faces that I really recognize. It's just like, hey, I know that. So we're going on to a sort of short section now where this is your chance to ask the panel questions that you might have for them. I'm going to have there's one from Millie Guest, and she's written, parents are fearful of their jobs, so they don't want to rock the boat often. However, if they were to see their company bosses doing climate activism, they might take a lead from that. Are there ways to get heads of companies to get involved, to move the big corporations, the business people who are seem to be so destructive in their practices, or at least locked down in these ways, that these systems that are so destructive. Any one of you, speaking as activists and authors, how do we change the minds of the people who seem to be controlling too much right now? Rupert.
Yeah, it's such a great and important question. One thing I would say is that in my experience, there are some heads of businesses and other organizations who are at least sort of willing to listen, or in some cases fully sympathetic. When I was in Davos last year, I found a surprising number, surprising to me anyway, of big sort of business leaders who had been woken up to some significant extent by the school climate strikes, typically by their own children, especially their own daughters. This had made quite a difference to them. So one thing I would say is, in some cases at least, there may be a door that is more open than you think to push on. And I guess one thing I would encourage people to do is start trying to push on some of those doors. This is the sort of second level that I spoke about in my 4 levels, what people can do in their jobs. And one of the things that they can do potentially is talk to other people, including their superiors, and and see what can be done. And you may be surprised that in the time that we're in, the reception may be more positive than you expect.
Yeah, absolutely. Rowan or Roman, any thoughts on how to, in addition to Rupert's, how to move some of the systems that are holding us in place?
Maybe I'll say something on this briefly. I guess when it comes to economic systems, one of the fundamental problems is the kind of split personality of large corporations. So you can get a company which has a CEO who's quite enlightened, say Paul Polman from Unilever, right? Introduces a big sustainability push, abolishes quarterly reporting on the day he becomes CEO. But then, because it's still owned by its shareholders, Unilever is subject to incredible short-term pressures. So they were almost taken over in 2018 by Kraft Heinz. So when you've got your purpose not aligned with your ownership and finance, there's a huge problem, right? So if you're going to change big companies, one of the core things you need to do is change the way that they are owned and financed. They're not subject to these short-term drivers. So there are different ways of doing this. Okay, John Lewis has 90,000 employees who are owners of the companies. You know, they're partners, and that gives it a bit more of a long-term feel. Or take a company like the renewable energy company, Good Energy. 2/3 of their investors are their customers. And just to add about Good Energy, they recently launched something called a Good Future Board, inviting teenagers to be a kind of a shadow board to help direct the company into the decades ahead. So I'm not saying any of this is easy. It's actually, I think, really comes down to a lot of the nitty gritty about ownership and finance. And that's pretty tough to change.
Yeah. Rowan, shifting culture and systems.
I mean, I'd agree with Roman that there's some really fundamental legal structures that are at the heart of why companies act as they do, and that some of the incentives that are set up in the structures there can be really problematic. I work with Millie, and if I knew the answer to this question, we'd be trying to do it. But I think it is also important to recognise that lots of the people that are at the top of companies are parents, and that trying to get them to recognise that their actions are going to impact their children and their descendants, and get them to think in the good ancestor framing that Roman has so kind of powerfully outlined, I think is a really important way of trying to get that mindset shift that we need, as well as the kind of legal and structural shifts.
Yes, I think it's very important to remember that big corporations are made up of human beings. They're not sort of these faceless entities that we sometimes think of them as. A question from Sophie Lovett. How can we honestly separate this work from political ideology? I know we want to get everyone on board, but when the individualistic short-termism of neoliberal capitalism is driving this crisis, how can we pretend that politics aren't a massive part of the problem? It's quite... Anyone want to take that up? Rupert?
Yeah, so it's a really good and interesting question. My view is that Extinction Rebellion has contributed something quite valuable to thinking about this question, which is the idea of being beyond party politics and beyond ideology. Consider the precedent of the Second World War, where something similar applied and you had a national government. So in the Second World War, you had famously, for example, crucially, food rationing. Now, if you'd have said to people in the 1930s, we're going to bring in food rationing, the Conservatives would all have said, no, you're not, that's a ridiculous sort of socialist plot or something like that. But it wasn't brought in the 1940s because of socialism. It was brought in as a practical response to the emergency situation which the UK was undergoing under potential blockade from the German Navy and so forth. In other words, when there is an emergency, people can see quite often beyond the constraints of the ideology that they may have been in at that point, up to that point. They can see what needs to be done and how to pull together to do it. So what we need to do is to start to find effective ways, and I'm hoping that the emerging parents movement can do a lot of this, finding effective ways to get people to understand that they are vulnerable, that their children are even more vulnerable, and that we need to have thinking in response, which is not stuck within the confines of ordinary political ideological choices. And again, like in the Second World War, that may sometimes mean that quite dramatic things happen, which might be thought to be standardly quite left-wing things or quite green things, but they'd be happening because of the exigencies of the emergency.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking, as you speak, I think about the hard fight that the supporters of the Green New Deal in the US have at the moment, where everything that's deemed remotely socialist in ideology is thrown out immediately by the Republicans. I think they've got a massive fight on their hands, but it seems that we have a responsibility to keep calling the emergency and making people, you know, everyone understand the state that we're in. Rowan or Roman, did you have anything to add to that particular question?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to come in on that and talk about, I mean, I completely agree that it is really important to find ways to communicate about climate across the political spectrum and to engage in a way that doesn't align with party politics. I think that's absolutely essential. And particularly if we're talking about intergenerational activism and talking about kind of engaging different age groups, we need to be able to work outside some of those kind of political silos. I think the work that Climate Outreach have done recently has been really interesting, where they've started to analyse, particularly in the UK, how different groups of society respond to climate messaging. They've put out some work last year called Britain Talks Climate that talks about how 7 different segments of society across the political spectrum respond to climate messaging. And that sort of analysis we're trying to incorporate into the parent climate work in the UK with Parents for Future at the moment, to try and make sure that our messaging can resonate effectively with the groups that we're trying to target. So I think it is really important to incorporate that political dimension or a political dimension into the messaging from an early stage.
Okay, Roman?
I think I'd say the first thing is, let's look for potential coalitions and connections beyond left-right or across left-right. So just the very fact that, you know, intergenerational activism can potentially bring in, I think, as I've said a bit earlier, you know, climate activists, people caring about long-term public health reform, mental health impacts of COVID going on for decades, technological risks, as I mentioned, bioweapons and things, racial injustice. These are all ways of galvanizing people around something kind of similar, something intergenerational. And certainly when I've done, for example, briefings of members of parliament in the UK, Scottish Parliament, also other places, one of the ways I've gone into the topic is one I think we all kind of would agree with here, is to go in talking about children, grandchildren, legacy. That's the bridge to the then more often very difficult and real conversations, which are about left and right, like how are we going to shift to a post-growth economy, right? And at the moment, that is very much a kind of a left-right issues, as you were saying there, Bel, about, you know, the Green New Deal and stuff. It's associated with left. There are changes, you know, going on in that realm. But it's pretty tough to convince the neoliberal cohort that the growth curve can't keep going up and up and up, and at some point the bubble's going to burst. But, you know, there is a shift away from that. And the more that the, let's say, the planet itself becomes the locus of politics, the more we can move away from the left, right, and pivot to a different kind of attractor of politics, let's say, to borrow some phrases from Bruno Latour, if anybody's into him.
Yeah, totally into him. But are you sure you're quite right, Roman, in what you just said there about left and right on the growth issue? My experience is that most people on the left are as adamantly pro-growth as
you're
most
right.
people on the right.
I totally said that wrong. So you're right. I'm wrong. You're right.
Yeah, I think
because I mean,
actually, it's an interesting. The growth question is an interesting question where we do need to just move beyond the traditional spectrum.
Yeah, I'd say one thing there. I'd say definitely since the end of the Second World War, governments left, right, center have all had the same addiction to GDP growth. No question about that. I'd say there's more movement, let's say, on the left towards post-growth, degrowth, well-being economies, donor economics, but still it's a fundamental issue that they're grappling with, including the Green New Deal cohorts in the US too. It's very difficult for them, but I agree, you're right.
We're slightly running out of time, and we've got some amazing questions coming in. And Rupert, I really wanted to ask this question. It's from Gudrun, Press. And she talks about, she wants to talk to you about some really key ideas in your book, which was the idea of radically expanding citizens' assemblies and appointing guardians of future generations. She says it seems like a very good way to break the deadlock in current institutions. And how can we fight for these reforms? How can we argue for them and support them?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's a really important question. It brings out something which is really fundamental to my book, which we haven't talked about yet, except that Roman did mention it briefly in his remarks, but my Guardians Future Generations idea, which gets developed in the book. The idea there being, look, we need to include in our democracy those who are excluded because they're not alive yet. We need to somehow find a way of representing them, the children of the future, and that's what that idea boldly tries to do through imagination and through the principle of representing all constituents in the demos, in the people, including those who are not present yet. So the question Gudrun asked is, how can we argue for these ideas? How can we get them to happen? How can we get this expansion of democracy to happen? Because that's really what this idea is, that we need to expand democracy to include, not to be fixated not just on present day parents, but on those who are to come. And I guess I don't have a full answer. My answer, insofar as I've got it so far, is well, we need this emerging parents movement. We need it to get a lot bigger, and we need, as Roman and others have said, to encourage a sort of expanded sense of time. And that happens through the culture, that happens through education, that could happen through politics as well, that could happen through the movement that we're trying to build. People saying that we urgently need to think long term, stuff like that. That's about as far as I've got. I would love to hear what others think about this. How can we make this expansion of democracy seem like common sense? How can we effectively campaign for it?
Rowan?
Ours on this panel.
Well, maybe I'll just say something very briefly here that of course, there's lots of models to look at already in this realm. So we've got the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. There is a Wellbeing for Future Generations bill before Parliament at the moment, which is for the whole UK to have a Future Generations Commissioner, but improved on the Welsh model by having a citizens' assembly aspect to it, or a citizens' panel, which is kind of advisory, sort of bringing together the idea of a guardian for the future and a citizens' assembly. But I think we can also look to other parts of the world where there's some really exciting models in this area. And something I've written about, well, in various places, is this movement in Japan called Future Design, where they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically split them into two groups. Half are told they're residents in the present day, and the other half are given these almost ceremonial kimonos or robes to wear and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out the residents from 2060 systematically advocate far more radical town and city plans, whether it's long-term healthcare investment or climate change action. And this movement's now spread to big cities like Kyoto, Japan's Ministry of Finance, and is ready to be exported around the world. It's a kind of future citizens' assembly model, more explicitly taking a leap forward in time. So let's play with that in towns, in cities, in communities, in workplaces, all over the place.
Yeah. Sounds like a really joyous process. Rowan?
Yeah, I completely agree, Roman. I'd love to see that introduced at the COP, to have some people there representing future generations wearing ceremonial robes. I think that would be extremely powerful to have that as an intergenerational action. We've done some work around the UK Future Generations Bill with Parents for Future UK, and the Parents for Future global groups are planning work at the moment around kind of intergenerational legislation in a much broader sense. So taking some of the principles of the Welsh Wellbeing and Future Generations Act and working out how different countries can apply that. It necessarily is needing to look very different in different countries. Some countries have tried it previously. Israel, for example, did have a Future Generations Commissioner, but it got a bit too powerful, and so it got axed after not very long. So some countries have tried it. Some countries do have some sort of intergenerational legislation in place, but not in very many places. I think there's a lot more interest in it, and I think there's a lot of potential for doing campaigning around this. And I'm really looking forward to building some more campaigns of all generations working on this type of legislation. But as a lawyer, it's quite difficult to write that law well.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. That's been such an incredibly valuable, and I actually really am looking forward to watching it again, because as a co-host, I kind of don't hear everything. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Now, I think we're going to hear a final call to action from the host groups. Miranda from Extinction Rebellion Families, Sarah from Mothers Rise Up, also Parents from the Future. I'm not sure if they're ready to go ahead, or in fact, if I've got the right names.
Anna from Parents for Future, I think is.
Okay, great. Anna, you ready to go? Oops. Miranda?
Yeah, I can go. Hi, yeah, I'm Miranda from XR Families. Thanks so much to everyone who came. Yeah, just a message here to the parents that have joined the meeting. We'd love you to join us if you're not already involved with XR Families. We can't be out on the streets together at the moment. We can't meet in person, but there's still absolutely loads we can do. And we do have lots of exciting plans. We'd love to see you at one of our meetings. We'd love to hear your ideas and hear your story. And to all the non-parents here, we really need you too. Parents have it really tough right now. We're all supporting our kids at home, homeschooling, working, trying to do climate activism as well. We really need non-parents to support us, to join us, to be with us. I'm sure everyone can think of a child that they care about, even if it's someone they just see occasionally, or just that child you pass in the street, in the supermarket. This is what Rupert's book is all about, our love for those children, our sense of connection and our responsibility towards them. So please, we want to have every single one of you. We'd love to have you. 2021 is a crucial year for climate action, and it's a year that could make or break how we respond to this crisis. And on our own, we are quite small, but together we are powerful and can drive change. And whatever happens, we know we will look our children in the eye and tell them that we fought for them, that they're going to inherit. So please come and join us and fight with us. So I'm going to pass over to Anna.
Could one of the hosts just on? Okay.
Oh, hi. I'm Anna from Parents for Future. Yeah, firstly, thanks again, Rupert. We're extremely grateful for your support for the parent movement. Parents for Future was set up in early 2019, inspired by Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement, with the idea of showing support for the young people in their demands for a safe future and inspiring adults to take action alongside them. The movement is international. There are Parents for Future groups in Europe, Africa, India, the US and South America, and we're all part of a wider network of parent climate groups around the world. There are also regional Parents for Future groups here in the UK working on local issues. I'm part of the Bedfordshire group. To give you an idea of what types of work we do, here are a few things we are doing at the moment. We're developing creative arts and storytelling projects with a parent perspective in the run-up to COP26. We're working with our sister organisation, Mothers Rise Up, on a supportive and fun Mother's Day project. We're encouraging long-term decision-making through our support for the Wellbeing for Future Generations Bill as a way of opening up conversations on the links between climate change and intergenerational justice. We are also setting up regional groups to engage on pressing local issues from a parent perspective. Parenting during this pandemic is particularly overwhelming, and with climate change preying on our minds as well, it's comforting to find others who understand how it feels so that we can support each other. We advocate the concept of creating hope by taking action and encouraging others to do the same. We are working on diversifying our movement and reaching out to different people within the UK to share the platform as widely as possible. In the early days before lockdown, many of us joined the youth strikes and marches. And since lockdown, we've even managed to get out on a couple of socially distanced actions. But you don't have to carry a banner to be part of our movement. We're all about building relationships, raising the conversation at work with our families and in our communities. I suspect many of you here, in fact, probably most of you, are already active within the climate and environment movement. But join us too, or join another group and keep up the good work. You're all doing a fantastic job. Thank you, everyone.
And do we have Mothers Rise up here tonight?
Yes, we do. Hello there. Sorry about my flustered start. I obviously am a mother, and putting a little one to bed can not always go to plan. They seem to always sense there's something going on. So yeah, I'm a co-founder of Mothers Rise Up, and we got together in 2018 at an Extinction Rebellion march, and we wanted to fill a different gap. And I always see there's sort of layers of action from your household to your local community to multinational companies, banks and government. And then if you're as far reaching as Rowan, then other countries. And in Mothers Rise Up, we really wanted to be as inclusive as possible. And so we decided not to press for sort of personal change as some of the other action groups do, but just to keep it to direct action. And so we did a fabulous march in 2019 to demonstrate to the government how important climate change is for parents. And then we did sort of tongue-in-cheek climate rhyme time outside Shell and BP at 7 in the morning with children had changed the words to nursery rhymes. And I love the power of the parent. The media were there, and I did sense fear on the CEO of Shell's face when a little toddler was shaking a maraca, and you can't help but be moved by that, as Roman mentioned. And outside BP, we met with their media relations man and had a chat to him, and a woman who, her name I can't remember, but she works for their renewable area. So we, although we're a small group, we do some great creative actions, and we're very grateful for the support of XR Families and Parents for Future, who help us. So I really felt wanted to resonate Matt Cooper in the chat, who said parents are time poor. And I think, we're a group who we have children dependent on us, we have jobs, and then also sometimes elderly and infirm parents to look after. And sometimes you're asking me to do one more thing, really, but actually I would say that getting involved is an amazing experience, because you feel comforted, you feel supported, and just even a small thing is possible. And the variety of actions you can take, from the eco families ripple effect to the Parents for Future writing cards for the Future Generations Bill, there's a fantastic range of ways to get involved, and it makes you feel better, it empowers you, and it's a fabulous example to your children that you are doing your best for them.
Yeah.
So you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and mothersriseup.org.uk.
I think you're right. I think, if we didn't get out on the street, sometimes we'd find our roles in life so much more difficult. I'd get so frustrated. I'd like to end really with just a very, very short quote. In 2019, Iceland lost its first glacier, and on the site they put a plaque up, and the glacier was called Ok, and they wrote, and it was called A Letter to the Future. The plaque was titled A Letter to the Future. Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and know what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. Let's keep fighting for what we know we need to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Bel, for moderating beautifully.
That's all right. That's okay. Thank you, Rowan. Thank you, Rupert. Thank you, Roman.
Thank you for the invitation to take part.
Thank you. It's been super. And we'll be sharing the recording afterwards for those who wish to share it on. For those who weren't able to be here this evening, I think we got maxed out on numbers, which is exciting. There were people trying to get in who couldn't. So yeah, shows there's some real interest, which is great.
And everybody, buy this book. It's great.